Ladies and gentlemen, please visit the kiosk down the hall from this ballroom in Chesapeake Corridor to cast your vote for your presidential pick in the official Washington Times CPAC straw poll. You may also vote hassle-free through the CPAC 2014 mobile app.
The American dream. It's synonymous with everything good and the right of every citizen. It's never easy. Success takes hard work, perseverance, stamina, and holding fast to core beliefs. But an out-of-control government has put the dream in jeopardy. 8 out of 10 Americans think it's harder to achieve the dream now than before, and will be even worse for the next generation.
Somebody else made that happen.
Fortunately, a powerful voice has arisen to put we the people back in charge, to revitalize the dream. The modern-day Tea Party movement is stronger than ever. Grassroots are growing deeper. Millions of patriots are organizing locally. New, conservative, principled leaders are emerging. The hope for a better tomorrow is strong because everybody deserves the opportunity to pursue the American dream. Tea Party patriots, pursue your American dream.
Your nation. Your news.
Coming up on One America News.
National and international news. Credible and unbiased 24/7.
Stay tuned as we bring you the latest headlines from across the nation and around the world.
6,000 people flee.
We will not block their conservative message. We will be their platform.
Political talk shows. Substantive, bold, and comprehensive.
The left says they're all about other people's ideas until they realize other ideas exist.
There are too many taxes, too many regulations, too much government intervention in people's lives for this economy to grow.
A new voice, your voice, for One America. Contact your cable provider and demand they carry One America News Network today.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Patrick Kilbride, Executive Director of America's Strategic Policy Initiatives at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Hey, good morning, CPAC. It's great to be here. Again, I'm Patrick Kilbride with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and it's a real pleasure to join you. I know it's been 2.5 days and your brains are very full. We're going to try to have a really lively session here. We've got 4 of the real thought leaders in the United States on U.S. global engagement in Latin America in particular, and so it's a real pleasure to bring them to you, and we appreciate the folks at CPAC prioritizing this important topic. At the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, we know that 95% of the world's consumers are overseas, and so we prioritize helping our businesses succeed in the global economy and helping make the United States more competitive in the global economy. And Latin America is an important part of that. Our number 1 and number 2 trading partners are our closest neighbors, Canada and Mexico. And together with the rest of the Americas, they account for 45% of all U.S. export sales to the world. And importantly, if you look at the period since 2009, since the depth of the financial crisis, we've seen that exports have grown by 50%. And recall, this is a period when U.S. GDP growth has been anemic, but our export sales are booming. We want to take advantage of that. We want to maximize that. We want to use it to create jobs in the United States of America. We've got a great group to discuss this with you. Beginning with Governor Luis Fortun. Governor Fortun is a partner at Steptoe & Johnson and the former governor of Puerto Rico. He's also served in the U.S. House of Representatives representing Puerto Rico. He's one of the leading champions of economic development on the island, and he's got a lot to offer in terms of how the U.S. engages the world and how the conservative community engages Latinos in the United States. Thanks, Governor. Next, we have Ambassador Roger Noriega. Ambassador Noriega is the founder and managing director of Vision Americas, a firm that helps U.S. companies succeed in global markets. He is also a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, helping to shape views about the world, and particularly about the Americas. He served with a lot of distinction at the U.S. Department of State as Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs, and he's been a key staffer to both the Foreign Affairs Committees in both the House and the Senate. He's also, I should add, a member of the Advisory Board for the American Conservative Union. So please welcome Roger. Next, a good friend, Dan Griswold, is the president of the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones, an organization that helps U.S. business succeed in the world through the Free Trade Zone Network. He was a trade expert, the director of trade policy at the Cato Institute, and he's the author of Mad About Trade, Why Main Street America Should Embrace Globalization. Welcome, Dan. And finally, a former colleague, Jason Marzak. Jason is the Deputy Director of the new Adrian Arsh Center for Latin America at the Atlantic Council. He just recently joined the Atlantic Council from the American Society and Council of Americas in New York, where he was the policy director. Previously, Jason's worked with the Partners of the Americas at their Center for Civil Society, and he was an important congressional staffer on Capitol Hill. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is our panel, and we look forward to the conversation. All right. In the interest of really making this a conversation, I've asked the panelists to keep their initial remarks short. We're going to really encourage a back and forth with you and with themselves so that we can quickly get to your questions. Governor Fortun, I'd like to begin with you if I could. You know, you've had roles in both the legislature and the executive branch, and I think you've seen how important Latin America is, certainly to Puerto Rico's economy, but also to the U.S. Can you start us off and just give us some thoughts on why this region is so important?
Of course, and I thank you again for the opportunity. Just to put this into perspective, we do 3 times more business with Latin America than with China, and twice as much business with Colombia than with Russia. Latin America actually purchases 1 out of every 4 products that we export in the world. And Mexico alone buys 75% more from us than China does. So this is very important for our economy. And certainly in terms of the U.S., we account for 40% of the region's imports and exports, and they totaled about $400 billion in export, U.S. exports, and about $450 billion in imports. So it is very important economically and certainly geopolitically as well.
Thanks, Governor. And let me, before we go on, let me just mention 2 quick things. Number one, obviously we're going to take some questions from the floor for the audience in the room, but folks who might be following online should tweet their questions to @CPAC News, #Kilbride Panel. That's KILBRIDE panel, PANEL. Ambassador Noriega, maybe we go next to you. With your experience, you know, in the State Department, at the Organization of American States, and in other roles, where do you see Latin America today, and what are the stakes for the United States?
Well, they're extraordinarily high. Obviously, 5th grade geography, we know that this is our natural market. And it's been a long time since I've been in the 5th grade, and we know now that if we're going to compete in the world vis-a-vis China, we need to make the most of those relationships, those natural relationships with our neighbors close to our shores. 3 of our top 4 energy producers are from the Americas, Canada being number 1. We get 28% of our energy from Canada, 10% of our energy from Mexico, 9% from Venezuela. So to the extent that we are still dependent on foreign energy, which is a choice that unfortunately we make, we need to be concerned about this region. And then finally, security. In a post 9/11 world, we simply have to have stability and security among our neighbors close to our shores. Political stability, yes, but also a state that has the viability to control its own borders, and so that these 30 countries that we share this hemisphere with aren't the weak links in the security chain as we confront terrorism and even something like the international narcotics threat.
Thanks, Ambassador. Dan, you've been doing trade for a long time now. Sort of give us some of the data, like what's important to for this group to know about just what a big difference Latin America makes for us in terms of our global commerce.
Yeah, Latin America is a huge opportunity for the United States, not just commercially, but culturally, in terms of security. You know, I see engagement with Latin America from a conservative American point of view, a win-win-win. I mean, we get the mutual benefits from trade. We help lift millions of people into the middle class. We help spread ideas of free and open societies, and we happen to reinforce our security and foreign policy relations along the way. And is Latin America an untapped market? I'm not sure I'd say that. We've made a lot of progress down there. As the governor mentioned, more than 1/4 of US exports now go to Latin America. 19% of what we buy from the rest of the world is from Latin America, not just energy. And here's a key figure to keep in mind. US companies have 3 times as much manufacturing investment in Latin America as they do in China. It looms very, very large. And just the final thing, you know, I grew up with President Reagan coming into office, and I know he spoke about this vision of a free trade area from the Yukon to Tierra del Fuego. I say we've largely achieved it. We have free trade agreements with 20 other countries, more than half of them in Latin America. 80% of our trade with Latin America is with countries that we have free trade agreements with. If you look at the map, go back to your 5th grade geography, with the exception of Ecuador, the whole Pacific coast of the Americas is tied to the United States in a web of free trade agreements. I think that's something to celebrate.
Good. Dan, you mentioned China. I want to come back to that in a minute, but Jason, maybe you could give us a sense, what is special about Latin America today that creates an opportunity for the United States?
Well, thank you again, Patrick, for having me here. And I think echoing the comments of fellow panelists, of the governor and Dan, is looking at the trade potential of Latin America and the fact that, you know, we oftentimes focus on China insofar as our trade potential, but we don't, you know, I think it's oftentimes goes unnoticed the fact that, you know, our trade with Mexico, for example, is, you know, our exports to Mexico are more than our exports to Japan and China combined. And not just on the trade level, but also the region has changed significantly in the last decade. This is not your grandfather's Latin America. The region has become more middle class, higher levels of education, macroeconomic stability, increased use of technology, relative political stability, barring a couple countries, but much more stable than in the past. You have over the last decade an increase of over 50% in the middle class. More than 50 million people entered the middle class in Latin America in the last decade. What does that represent? That represents a huge market potential for US business to be able to tap into this growing middle class in Latin America and countries where the rule of law is increasingly more sound and where there's greater macroeconomic stability.
It's a really important point, Jason. You know, when you think about the middle class, and what happens when the middle class grows in Brazil and Mexico, the opportunities that opens for the United States in terms of services, access to credit, all sorts of financial services, and also the social and political economic ramifications. You know, what does a growing middle class do that changes the way a country's society thinks about its relationship with the United States?
Yeah, well, I think that what you've seen is you see this growing middle class in countries like Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Colombia, and this increasing growth of the middle class, what it actually does is it puts greater demands on the government to be able to implement policies that respond to the needs of the middle class. And what are the needs of the middle class? Well, growing middle class means more demand for energy. It also means more demand for American-made refrigerators, televisions, and other products, and also forces, puts more pressure on government to be able to strike the economic and commercial relationships with the U.S. and with other trade partners to be able to feed the consumption demands of the middle class. And I would also say, going back to Dan's point, is we want the United States to be able to tap into those demands and not have China come in and be the export, preferential trade partner with Latin America.
Governor.
If I may add, and I think the case in point is what has happened with that 50 million people moving into the middle class. They have new aspirations, not just material, but they yearn for freedom. And freedom actually is conformed in many ways that just voting every 4 years. And that economic freedom has lent itself to tremendous growth in the area, and these are our natural allies. We should not be looking elsewhere but close to our home. And number one. Number two, in those countries where that individual freedom has not blossomed in the same way, you see that they are not performing as the rest of Latin America is. Case in point, Venezuela and Argentina are not growing at the same pace that Peru and Chile and Mexico are growing. And it has a lot to do with individual freedom. There's nothing more powerful. We can talk about figures, nothing more powerful than freedom.
That's a great point. Yep. Ambassador?
Yes, just to complement what's being said here, the other thing is the United States is a much better partner for these countries than, for example, China. You see the Chinese going in very heavy-handed ways in engaging in extractive industries. So their priority is to pull away raw materials, scraping iron ore and carting it back to China, soybeans, that sort of thing. So that sort of trade doesn't generate the economic growth and diversification in those economies. On the other hand, the U.S. with decades of engagement there and foreign direct investment in these countries, being part of those economies, is a much better partner. So here you see people moving into this consumer class, a growing middle class that favor consumer goods made in the United States, for example, that begin to recognize and understand for themselves the benefits of freedom and free markets, and really preferring that kind of engagement to this exploitive engagement that you see from the Chinese. And the other part of that equation is I'm in private business now, and we advise a lot of clients who are looking at moving their factories out of China and closer to our shores, into stable economies, stable markets that offer the geographic advantages, as well as countries that respect the rule of law here in the Americas.
That's absolutely right. And Dan, do you want to follow up on that
Just
point?
a quick point. One of the other advantages the United States has over China is not just geography, but a cultural affinity. We have tens of millions of Hispanics in this country, engaged in business, with ties to friends and colleagues back in these countries. That's a tremendous advantage. The Hispanic population in China is pretty small. And also the cultural affinity. I've spoken to students at the Monterrey Technical Institute in Mexico and the AFIT University in Medellin, Colombia. And you just see their strong affinity to the United States. I know a lot of the leaders in that part of the world, not that many, but the Hugo Chavez's of the region are hostile to the United States. But that middle class in Latin America, those aspiring students, they look to the United States. It's a tremendous advantage that we have.
So let's follow up on that, in terms of partnerships. Ambassador, you talked about energy. What do you think are the opportunities? When we look at the United States today, we have a huge opportunity with the shale boom. And I think there's a tendency to think, well, we've got it taken care of here at home. What's the argument for engaging with our close neighbors, Mexico and Canada, but also with Brazil and others in the hemisphere on a regional sort of energy security?
Well, we could certainly be energy independent just here in North America. And a key building block of that is the Keystone Pipeline, which is a no-brainer, really, for the United States. And our relationship with Canada. And by the way, if anybody who thinks the Canadians are patient and are going to wait forever has never seen a hockey game. And they can sell that oil to the Chinese, and I'm sure that they're fighting the Chinese off because they'd rather do business with their neighbors close to home. Mexico, too, just adopted energy reform legislation. We'll see how it's implemented, whether they actually move in the direction of a market economy, a market petroleum industry, and welcoming private capital, welcoming foreign investment, technology, and that sort of thing to build up that industry. That is extraordinarily important, again, to the availability of energy here in the Americas. When you see, for example, what's happening in Brazil, a state-run oil company underperforming. You remember in 2007, these vast deposits that were announced. Well, guess where they are? They're still underground and underwater. Because the state-run company does not have the capital, the technology, and you have the politicians interfering in how that company's run. So thank God we don't have a state-run oil company, because we turn it into a disaster like Chavez has done in Venezuela.
Just to pick up on the Mexico point, I mean, I think that, you know, Roger makes an excellent, I mean, Mexico's energy reform that was passed in December, and they're now working on secondary legislation. This is a huge opportunity for U.S. business in Mexico. Basically, Mexico nationalized energy about 75 years ago. And there's been no private investment allowed in Mexico. And what's happened as a result is that there's a lot of untapped potential in Mexico's energy market. With this energy reform, it opens up Mexico to private investment in its energy fields, both onshore and offshore, shale and others. And this is huge opportunities for U.S. energy companies. And going back to kind of energy independence in North America, it really kind of helps us to eventually achieve that goal, which I think is possible, of an energy independent North America. And it opens up real opportunities for U.S. business. This is also projected to add 2% to the Mexican GDP by 2025 and add millions of jobs to Mexico. And these millions of jobs in Mexico, again, we're so interrelated that those millions of jobs also present millions of new consumers for U.S. products, given the close relationship, given the $1 billion a day in trade that we do with Mexico every day.
Well, you know, all of you have talked about the important ways that we have an opportunity to partner with Latin America. Let's talk a little bit about some of the specific markets, because I think what we've seen is that our neighbors, and this is our neighborhood, can either be a source of social good for the United States, of economic prosperity and innovation, or it can be a source of social ills. And we've seen in the past illegal immigration and related security issues. And particularly, I think, immigration, of course, has been a big topic. In the last few years, we've seen that net flows of immigration from Mexico have slowed, while that economy's done a little bit better. But in Central America, we continue to see, I think, more people. And it sort of highlights the stake we have in engaging these markets. What do you think are some of the biggest individual country opportunities? Anyone?
Well, if I may, I was going to say in Peru, for example, we have seen tremendous growth in their economy. And mining has been extremely successful in Peru, but they're moving their economy, into more high-tech businesses. What we've seen, we've talked about Mexico, but I would like to talk about Colombia and the growth both in the manufacturing and the agricultural sectors in Colombia. Colombia is a country that, as we all know, underwent a tremendous violent period of time, given the fact that they were fighting the guerrillas. President Uribe was able to tame that, and we enter into a free trade agreement with Colombia, and what we've seen is tremendous growth in Colombia. Now they are actually doing something that we should be discussing here as well. They are tapping into private capital to develop their infrastructure. Roads, airports, ports, something that we should be doing here as well, so that we can actually enjoy world-class infrastructure as many of the other parts of the world are doing.
Well, note that the governor has referenced countries with which we have free trade agreements. That's a legacy, really, of the Bush administration. 8 or 9 countries with which we secured free trade agreements. And countries with which we have free trade agreements in the world today represent about 1% of the GDP of the globe. They are 46% of the country. They import 46% of our goods. I mean, that is extraordinarily important. Those relationships that with countries that are committed to the free market, and it generates a demand for our products, but as well as a modernization of their own economies. And as you build a middle class up, you strengthen the political roots and the institutions in their countries.
Yeah, let me mention one other tool that is a good thing happening. We've got the free trade agreements. We have a federal program that you probably haven't heard of, but the Foreign Trade Zones program here in the United States. And there are a number of Latin American countries that have free zone programs of their own. And in a nutshell, the free zones allow commerce to take place outside the customs territory of the country. So you can bring goods in, manufacture, re-export, or sell them in the local market, and you're outside U.S. customs territory when you do that. They're basically free ports, and customs only steps in when it gets sold in the local market. It's a very successful program here in the U.S. I'd be happy to talk to anybody afterwards. I've got some material. But it's very successful in Latin America. My association, the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones, has a cooperation agreement with ASVA, the Association of Zonas Francas in Latin America. And there's over 20 countries in Latin America that have very robust zones programs. And a lot of them have been mentioned. Colombia has a number of zones. Peru, Panama has the second busiest free zone in the world after Hong Kong, in Cologne on the Atlantic side near the canal. Puerto Rico, it's one of the success stories in Puerto Rico. There are 3 very busy U.S. foreign trade zones in Puerto Rico, employing Puerto Ricans at good wages in pharmaceuticals, automotive industry, electronics. And by the way, this is a program that doesn't even have a line item in the federal budget, doesn't involve loans or subsidies of any kind. It just reduces tariffs on key components to keep manufacturers competitive.
I think just looking at countries that have the greatest opportunity, one thing we haven't talked about is something called the Pacific Alliance. And the Pacific Alliance are 4 countries, Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Colombia, that a couple of years ago got together and said there's a lot of different integration organizations in Latin America. Some are more effective than others. But they said from the ground up, let's figure out a way to really promote trade between our 4 countries, promote greater labor mobility, combine stock markets, just whatever we can so that we can be a greater force. A couple of weeks ago, they eliminated 92% of tariffs among the 4 countries. Interestingly, among those, looking at those 4 countries, the U.S. also has, as Roger's pointing out, the U.S. also has free trade agreements with all these countries. And so this is a huge opportunity. Morgan Stanley predicts over 4% growth in this block of countries. And much of this block of countries as well, except for Colombia, is also part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations with Mexico and the United States. And so those countries have seen, as we look at kind of the divide in the region, they have really taken that market-oriented approach to economic growth. And I would also say a huge untapped possibility is also Brazil. The U.S. does not have a free trade agreement with Brazil. China surpassed Brazil as the country's top trade. China surpassed the United States, as Brazil's top trading partner a few years ago. And with this increased growth in the middle class in Brazil, this is a huge opportunity for the United States.
So great point. And before we continue, I just want to remind folks, if you want to get involved in the conversation, tweet your questions to @CPAC News, #Kilbride Panel. We'll be glad to take online questions. Also, I want to remind you to vote in the straw poll. Get on the mobile app and get your views on record. Jason, you talked about the Pacific Alliance, and Roger, the importance of FTAs. And if you take a step back, U.S. leadership in creating the multilateral rules-based trading system is especially important to the global economy. And we talked a little bit about having an economy south of our border the size of China's. And in fact, it was the U.S. that facilitated China's entry into the World Trade Organization, into the global trading system in 2001. And that came at a cost for us, for the world, for many of our trading partners in terms of, divergence of trade. But today, I think we see where the opportunities are coming back around, and especially close to home, we've seen a trend of reshoring or nearshoring, where investment has come back to North America, and we're creating jobs in the United States as well as in Mexico and Canada, because our costs, as China has succeeded in the global economy and has lifted hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty, which is a social good. Now there's some balance coming back. What do you think is the strategy that allows us to maximize that trend of reinvestment in the United States?
Well, obviously we have to enforce trade rules, this rules-based system, and call China out when they violate those rules. Because I think we can be competitive, certainly vis-a-vis Latin America with them when all countries are required to play by the rules in a transparent way. Again, I think we are, because of our historic relationships, because these folks would rather do business with Americans that respect the rules. I think we're naturally competitive vis-a-vis China.
If I may add to what Ambassador Noriega has said about China, not only do we have historical and cultural affinities with the rest of the hemisphere, oftentimes when Chinese companies go into some of these countries, if there's a construction project going on, what have you, they bring in hundreds of Chinese workers. They don't employ locally. That's number one. Number two, the way they operate is so foreign to us that actually it creates friction in the region as well. Someone actually earlier mentioned heavy-handed attitudes and techniques indeed don't sit well. That's why we ought to provide that leadership that I will say, as Dan mentioned, commenced with President Reagan, when he envisioned this hemispheric free trade area where we could actually, I would say, integrate our economies. But with that comes everything else. And certainly we are seeing a more politically stable region to a great degree, because 50 million people in the region have moved up to the middle classes. And with that will come a lot more. It's a virtuous circle, I would say, that started precisely with that vision that President Reagan brought to bear.
And isn't that really America's greatest export, is this model of economic freedom and economic and social mobility that we have to share with our neighbors in Latin America? Roger, you pointed out the number of free trade agreements that were done during the previous administration. I think it was actually 15 of the 20 agreements were either negotiated or signed in just that, a brief period. And it was an amazing period of economic leadership for the United States. And, as you look at the rest of the hemisphere, what do you do now with the countries that we don't have free trade agreements with? Jason, help us, how do you bridge that divide between the market-oriented economies like those Pacific Alliance nations and the others?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the greatest strengths that we have as a country is our private sector, is our business community. And there's a real opportunity for the U.S. private sector to help to be a voice for change in countries across the region, right? Even though we don't have great relationships with Ecuador or Bolivia, we still have U.S. companies investing in Ecuador and investing in Bolivia and investing in Argentina and others. And so the private sector really provides that conduit for being able to kind of share American values with countries across the hemisphere with which which are not part of the Pacific Alliance, with which we don't have free trade agreements. And that is really, really important, because at a time when there might be not good government-to-government interaction, the business community really kind of can show the importance of kind of investment and how kind of fair rules of the game and whatnot can really help to drive economic growth.
Dan, you want to jump in?
Well, and this is one of the benefits of trade. It isn't just about specialization and gains. Those are all good, but it's about when goods cross borders, ideas cross borders, and people cross borders. And what you're seeing in Latin America is the demonstration effect. Those countries that have followed open free market principles, like Chile, like Colombia, like Peru, they're enjoying the rewards. And those countries that have tried to defy gravity, and they managed to run like the coyote over the cliff for a while because of oil revenues and things like that, but you're seeing the results of that coming home to roost in Argentina and Venezuela. Rampant inflation, empty store shelves, discontent out in the streets. And I think one of the most powerful things the United States can do is what we've done. Forge economic ties, engage in economic activity with these countries, and I think you're seeing the fruits of that policy.
Let me follow up with Dan real quick, Ambassador. Dan, there was a tweet from Benjamin Nanke. He says, don't forget the millennials. What do you say? I mean, you've spent a lot of your career really helping Americans to understand how they benefit from trade. What do you say to the younger generation that maybe hasn't heard the message yet, both in the United States and throughout Latin America?
That globalization and free trade are profoundly in your interest. More economic opportunity, a broader world of opportunity, the ability to interact with people from around the region and around the world. I think that's why you're seeing in Venezuela a huge youth component protesting against the government there, because they know it's their life's opportunities that are being smothered by the closed, inward-looking socialism of that country.
Ambassador?
Well, on that one point, then I've encouraged Latin Americans to look at diversifying their economy, building an innovation economy, building Silicon Valley in Latin America, looking to the future instead of just oil or commodities, other commodities, and that sort of thing. They have an opportunity to do sort of reinvent their future. But I would hope that none of us are seeing as advocating sort of mercantile relationships with Latin America, because I think they're values driven. I think in the Bush administration, certainly when we pursued free trade agreements, the president was not bashful about saying that this went hand in hand with democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. And so you can't just put these economic rules down, these regulations, and stand back and expect wonderful things to happen. Because if you do not have systems, and if you do not advocate systems in these countries that allow everyone from every walk of life to partake in the benefits of economic growth, it's just not going to produce the results that you need. It's not going to maximize the opportunities for them or for us.
So on that point, Ambassador, a lot of the world's attention is rightfully focused on Ukraine this week. How do we prevent, how do we work with our partners to prevent having a Ukraine in the Western Hemisphere?
Well, we have no foreign policy in Latin America today. This administration has no foreign policy. And 4 or 5 days ago, I realized why. There's no one at home. That 3 a.m. phone call for Latin America went to voicemail because Hillary Clinton said publicly that Venezuela is a democracy. I don't think any of us would argue with that. Well, then she must have been talking to a pretty ignorant crowd. But it sort of reflects a profound lack of understanding of what's happened in that country, the disintegration of institutions. And so why do people go out and protest? Because the institutions through which a citizen's voice is heard have been broken down, through which a citizen's security is secured, has been destroyed, because you had an authoritarian regime there that didn't want a professional police force. They wanted people to beat up their opponents. They didn't want a National Assembly that really worked. The opposition's underrepresented, and they literally beat up members and bloodied their noses on the floor of the National Assembly 6 months ago. So and all of this is played out, and the United States has been absolutely silent. And it's a real shame. We do not stand for anything in that part of the world. Not only in countries where governments have made themselves hostile to us, but with all the vast majority of the people in the country that expect the United States to stand for freedom, not only in the economic sense, but in the political sense as well.
Governor Fortun, and then let's go to Jason.
If I may add, you may recall in the Ukraine in 2009 that Russia cut off their gas supplies. Well, in our own hemisphere, Venezuela is a supplier of choice of many countries in the Caribbean, especially in the Caribbean bases through Petrocaribe. And actually, they are trying to control them politically with sometimes quite overt intervention in their internal matters. And we have been, as the ambassador has just stated, we have been doing nothing about it, and it is happening right here in our backyard.
That's good. You mentioned, both the Chinese business model of bringing in labor, investing in splashy public ways, but not investing in the communities or the countries. And you also mentioned Venezuela's politicism. How does the United States then, how do we exercise our influence in this region with our neighbors to make sure that they're not dependent on the Chinas and the Venezuelas? And can the private sector play a role in when governments aren't necessarily doing the job? What can the private sector do to step forward?
Well, one aspect was mentioned earlier, the XL pipeline. To the extent that we can exert leadership in the energy sector, that'll be extremely important in the whole region to begin with. But it's just exerting leadership and not leading from behind what we need.
And I would also argue, I think, unfortunately, Latin America has never been a top priority for the United States because we've always basically taken it for granted. We've taken for granted that even though we have this region of 580 million, Westerners, in our same continent, it has never been a priority for, U.S. foreign policy, unfortunately. Whether it's Venezuela or whether it's Honduras or Ecuador or whatnot. And I think that it's important that we really focus on kind of the geostrategic implications of Latin America, especially taking it back to this panel, looking at the market potential of Latin America, right? As Latin America grows, as the market economies grow, it puts downward pressure on unauthorized migration from Central America to come to the United States. It also provides new opportunities for youth in Central America and other places, so they don't have to resort to joining gangs that threaten the security of Central America. New economic opportunities also help to prevent some of the narco-trafficking challenges that we've seen across the hemisphere. And going back to the ambassador's point as well, is these free trade agreements that we have, they're not just for commerce, but they also kind of help to set the rules of the game in countries and rules of the game on our terms, not on their terms. They help to set the rules of the game insofar as making sure that our companies can compete with Chinese companies and others on our terms. And I think that's important to take into account, especially as well when we look at Mexico and we look at basically what the NAFTA free trade agreement has done to be able to kind of elevate the Mexican economy and put some of that, move those Mexicans to the middle class. This helped to result, Patrick, in some of that downward pressure on migration from Mexico.
Let's talk about a success story. I want to do a little pop quiz here. Does anybody know what the only Latin American nation to support the United States in the Korean War was? Anybody? I know the panel knows. It was Colombia. Oh. Colombia, who the United States came to the rescue of in the 1990s and early 2000s. When Colombia was on the verge, in some perspectives of being declared a failed state, it was the United States that invested in Colombia, that worked, on an institutional basis to build good governance, to engage the government of Colombia, and it's truly turned into a success story. You talked, Jason, about the Pacific Alliance. Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, four of the most dynamic economies in Latin America today. Some of them, in Peru's case, growing by about 9%. But a real opportunity. These countries have adopted a model that really reflects the success of the U.S. model. Where do we go from here with those countries to say, yes, we approve and we want to do more together? Dan, what's next? What's the next step?
Yeah, first let me just emphasize your point that Colombia is a success story. They still have a ways to go in terms of economic reform, but In 15 years, they've gone from a failed state to being a thriving, prosperous economy with a free trade agreement with the United States. I've been down to Colombia 2 or 3 times, and I think American views of Colombia are about 20 years out of date. I've been to Medellin and walked around downtown, and I looked at the murder rate. I'm safer in Medellin than I am in Washington, D.C. Maybe that's not saying as much as I could, but a wonderful success story. I was down there in Cali, Colombia, a year ago for a conference of the Western Free Zones, the Latin American Free Zones Association, and you just see the energy. Colombia has, I've heard, 100 free zones around the country. They really get the benefits of trade, the benefits of free markets and economic integration, and you see that growing middle class, and that is often the foundation for democracy and civil society. And I think Colombia is a good example of that, but there are others in Latin America. Ambassador?
I just wanted to note that only 1% of American companies export in this part of the world, and 60% of those are either to Canada or Mexico. So we can do a lot more in building bridges to those partners, potential partners in the region, making those connections and sort of letting the private sector folks go to work. Maybe encourage it a little bit with financing, but by and large, that's available, not only private financing from here, but private financing in the region. They have a lot of money that's available for these kinds of transactions. So, I mean, I would encourage the entrepreneurs here to look south for opportunities.
Governor, and then Jason.
If I may add, and I completely agree with the ambassador here, I would add something else. And we always have to be actually investing into our immediate future. And that is those younger kids, maybe 18 years old at this moment in the region. Many of them, their dream would be to actually get an American education, to go back, actually. And some years back, we did have a strong program in which a lot of people actually came here and actually went back to their countries with a degree from a U.S. university. That is extremely powerful, and actually it's a way to actually spread our ideals and our principles across the region as well.
I think that the governor's an excellent point. I mean, we have a program right now called 100,000 Strong in the Americas. There isn't funding for it, right? And this is the preeminent opportunity for us to be able to really instill American values and build relationships with the countries in the hemisphere, is by exchange, by education exchange, right? The president of Ecuador, for example, Rafael Correa, who we do not have a good relationship with, he went to college in the United States at least, right? And there's multiple stories of that of Latin American leaders today who went to college in the United States. And there's also opportunities not just for sending U.S. students abroad, but also for having more Latin American students study in the United States. This is actually a prerogative of President Peña Nieto of Mexico. As the Mexican economy has grown substantially in the last few years, one of the things that they're looking for is better higher education training, better engineering training and whatnot. So there's a whole program to try and bring more Mexican students here to study in the United States, then go back to Mexico and help to build the Mexican economy. I think on what steps, Patrick, going back to your question, could we do to further things? I completely agree with the ambassador. There's a huge untapped opportunity for U.S., especially small and medium-sized businesses, to be able to invest in Latin America, right? We're having this great discussion about Latin America. People are going to come away from this hopefully energized about the potential of Latin America, but then the questions could be, well, what do I do next, right? If you're a large business, if you're a multinational corporation, you know what to do next. If you're a small or medium-sized business or an emerging entrepreneur, it's very difficult to know what to do best. The more what to do to maximize some of those potentials with the region. So the more that we can do to set up those linkages with small businesses, medium-sized businesses in the U.S. to really tap into the market potential of Latin America, I think will go a long way.
Great. Well, a reminder, don't forget to get your straw poll votes in, and also if you want to tweet in questions, at CPAC News, pound Kilbride panel. Jason, another success story. You talked a little bit about Mexico. And Mexico today, as someone who visits frequently, much different place than it was a few years ago. What do you think the new administration in Mexico offers to the U.S.?
Yeah, Mexico today is very different from what you watch on the news about Mexico. I think what you see on the news generally is the violence, the insecurity, and that still, yes, that continues to be a problem in Mexico. But you also have a very different Mexico. You have a Mexico that is increasingly more educated. You have a much more middle-class Mexico. I think the ambassador was mentioning Chinese manufacturing, right? You have a lot of Chinese manufacturing jobs that have actually moved to Mexico. And I think it's also important to understand kind of our trade relationship with Mexico. It's very different from our trade relationship with other countries. When we are technically importing a product from Mexico, about 40% of that import was actually produced in the United States. Because of the real-time trade across the border, products, especially cars, will actually go across the border 8 times before they actually come to completion. So the trade relationship with Mexico helps to create actually about 1 in 24 jobs in the United States are dependent upon our trade with Mexico. And so this is a very different country. President Peña Nieto came into office about a year ago. He has in the last year tackled problems that have bedeviled Mexican presidents for decades. He's put across political reform, fiscal reform, education reform, energy reform that we've talked about. And these are all reforms that are helping to move Mexico into being the real partner that it can potentially be in the 21st century.
Governor, you've been a leader on the national stage now for some time, but you also naturally have a special relationship with Puerto Rico. What role does Puerto Rico play in U.S. success in the region?
We are natural-born citizens. We are part of the U.S., so we should be used as a bridge. The same way South Florida is, Puerto Rico should be another bridge to connect to the region. And it just makes so much sense that we do. In 2016, the expansion of the Panama Canal would have been finished and completed. That means that through that region, there's going to be a lot more trade than there is today. Puerto Rico and South Florida and other ports in that region actually present tremendous opportunities for added trade and to sell our products and services throughout the region.
Great. Dan, Puerto Rico is an important location for your members as well, I believe.
Yeah, the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones represents 700 people across the country and Puerto Rico who are involved in the Foreign Trade Zones program, local officials who administer the zones, companies involved from BMW and GE down to small and medium-sized companies. And the enthusiasm of our Puerto Rico members is quite infectious. There are, Puerto Rico's struggling right now. It's having some issues, but the foreign trade zones are one of the good things going on in Puerto Rico. There's one in Ponce, there's one in San Juan, there's one over on the west coast of the country, and pharmaceutical industries well represented there. Automotive distribution throughout Latin America. As the governor mentioned, it's really an ideal bridge to Latin America, and the Foreign Trade Zones program allows Puerto Rico to leverage that advantage. We should do everything we can to promote economic growth in the island. We're seeing migration to the United States for the first time since the 50s because of things going on there. One thing we could do is exclude Puerto Rico from the Jones Act. It is, because of the Jones Act, it's much more expensive to ship stuff to Puerto Rico than it is to the Dominican Republic or other countries.
Well, we could start with Hawaii and Puerto Rico being able to use foreign vessels to bring in American-sourced energy by natural gas and oil made here in America instead of buying it from Venezuela or other places.
Yes.
Well, and let's, I always, naturally working with Latin America, there's a natural association with the Latino community in the United States. And I've always argued when I spoke to Latinos here that this community will never be as strong as it can until the United States truly respects our neighbors as partners. Our relationship with Mexico, with Central America, is truly strong. Then the Latino community in the United States will have the stature it deserves. What do you think of that? And what does that mean for our engagement of the Latino community?
Yeah, may I just say, when I was Assistant Secretary, we hosted a couple of conferences for the what we called Andean USA and Central America USA, because what we wanted to do was reach out to those folks who were, had Central American ancestry or Andean or Peruvian, Colombian ancestry to help them understand what these free trade agreements meant, and so they could sort of get them started, jumpstart these transactions and deals, and reach out to them and sort of explain that the U.S. cared about their native lands. And it's important to demonstrate that foreign policy, meets sort of domestic policy. And if I could just sort of make one final comment on the security side of things, because the drug trafficking phenomenon has a profoundly negative impact, not only in the United States, where Mexican drug trafficking organizations are the biggest organized crime threat in the United States, but it sows mayhem in Central America and in the Andes. You have Venezuela, which among other problems is a narco state. So its leaders are not politicians who answer to popular will. They're criminals, and they're making billions of dollars being actors, not just complicit, but actors in the narco trade. And then you have an election in El Salvador tomorrow, where the FMLN party has the edge to be reelected. This is a party whose president enlisted the political support of MS-13, Mara Salvatrucha, the gangs, to get out the vote, not only in his campaign 2009, but the campaign that's going on right now. And a kingpin of that party has a direct relationship with the cocaine cartels in Colombia. So, the United States is absolutely silent on these issues. We haven't used available sanctions to sanction individuals who are involved in this kind of criminality. Name their names, take away their visas, freeze their bank accounts, and stigmatize them instead of standing back and letting them take over one country after another. So this has, if you don't think foreign policy or Latin America matters in your life, then you don't have a problem with street gangs or criminality or drug abuse in your community. So I think this matters to everybody.
And as a representative of business, I know that business prospers when security thrives. So it's a very important point, Ambassador. In the little bit of time we have left before everybody I know is excited to hear from Newt Gingrich, lightning round, last thoughts that you want to leave the audience, Governor Fortun.
Sure. Well, I thank CPAC for organizing this panel. It was President Reagan who many years ago actually envisioned this hemispheric pact where there will be free trade and flow of ideas and goods and people. Thanks to that leadership, a lot of things have occurred that are positive in the region. We're lacking leadership today, and it's unbelievable how the U.S., our nation, is seen throughout the region as a natural leader, not just politically speaking, but in terms of ideals and principles. It was President Reagan who thought of us as that shining city upon a hill. With the right leadership, that shining city will shine even brighter, and it will lighten up the whole region for our safety and for our well-being.
Governor, I can't think of any better way to conclude this panel. I think you've really summed up a sentiment that all of us here feel. And so I want to ask this distinguished group of experts on Latin America to really thank all of you for taking the time here. And we're all looking forward to Newt Gingrich. So folks, let's give the audience a round of applause.
Right in the front row.